Most people first hear the story of Cain and Abel as children. Two brothers, two offerings, one accepted and one rejected, and then an act of violence in a field that echoes through the rest of human history. It's one of those stories that lands hard even when you're young, because even then you sense there's something underneath it, something that isn't quite explained. Why was one offering rejected? What exactly did Cain do wrong before any of it happened? And why does the world after the murder suddenly contain other people, cities, and a whole civilization that nobody accounted for in the verses just before? Those gaps have bothered careful readers for a very long time, and somewhere along the way scholars started looking east, toward the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, toward the civilization that grew up between the Tigris and the Euphrates, thousands of years before the Hebrew Bible was written down. They looked toward Sumer, and what they found there was strange and familiar at the same time. Not a copy of the story, not a clean original that someone borrowed directly. Something more interesting than that. Older shadows of the same shapes. That's what this journey's about. If you're listening to this at night, settling in, maybe already letting the day go quiet, this is a good moment for exactly this kind of question. The kind that doesn't have a sharp answer, but pulls you gently forward anyway. Where do our oldest stories come from? What were people trying to say before the versions we inherited were written? And what does it mean when two completely different cultures, separated by centuries and geography, reach for the same images to explain the same human tensions? If you're new here, these are made for sleep or rest or long quiet drives, so let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's one of my favourite things about making these, checking the comments, and finding someone in Copenhagen at 2 a.m. sitting next to someone in Auckland who just woke up with coffee. Same words, completely different skies. Now, the first thing to understand before we go anywhere near the tablets is what we actually mean when we talk about Sumerian origins for a biblical story. Because that phrase gets used in a lot of places with very different levels of rigour. Sometimes people say it to mean the Bible copied Sumer directly, that a scribe somewhere took a Sumerian text and translated it nearly word for word. That claim is almost never true, and it's not what serious scholars are arguing. What they're actually tracing is something subtler. Cultural transmission, the way ideas, images, ritual structures and narrative patterns move across centuries and across cultures through trade, migration, conquest, and scribal education. Think of it less like plagiarism and more like how a melody passes from one musical tradition into another. By the time you hear it, it sounds different. The words are different, the instruments are different, but if you know what to listen for, you can still hear the original shape underneath. The evidence we have to work with comes in a few forms, and it's worth being clear about what each one is and what it isn't. We have clay tablets, thousands of them, recovered from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities over the last 2 centuries. Some of these tablets are administrative records, some are hymns, some are myths, some are what scholars call wisdom literature, which is essentially ancient philosophy wrapped in story. The tablets are real and physical, and they've been dated using both archaeological context and analysis of the cuneiform script itself, which changed over time in trackable ways. So when someone says a particular tablet dates to roughly 1700 BCE or 2000 BCE, that's not a guess pulled from nowhere. It's based on where it was found, what layer of the dig it came from, and what stage of the writing system it represents. Then there are the translations, and this is where things get genuinely complicated. Sumerian is one of the oldest written languages we know of, and for a long time it was completely unreadable. It was cracked slowly over the 19th and 20th centuries, and translation is still an active contested field. Some passages are clear, some are deeply ambiguous, some tablets are broken, with crucial lines missing. So when you read a translation of a Sumerian myth, you're reading a scholar's best interpretation of something that was already ancient when it was written down, and that exists now only in fragments. That's not a reason to dismiss it. It's a reason to hold it with the right kind of care. What we're going to do across this script is walk through what those tablets actually contain, what the parallels with Cain and Abel actually look like up close, and where the parallels hold and where they break down. Because the breakdown is just as interesting as the connection. When two stories diverge, that tells you something about what each culture was trying to say, what they kept, what they changed, what they added, and what they decided didn't belong. Those choices are where a culture's deepest values live. There's a story involving a farmer and a shepherd that shows up in Sumerian literature with remarkable resonance. There are ritual structures around offerings and divine favour that mirror the biblical scene with unsettling closeness. There are figures who wander, figures who are marked, figures who live at the edge of the known world in a kind of ambiguous exile. None of it is Cain and Abel, but all of it is reaching towards something recognizably related, and the dates on those tablets predate the composition of Genesis by anywhere from 500 to 1500 years, depending on which text and which scholarly estimate you're working from. So the mystery is real. The question of what the Hebrews knew, what they heard, what they absorbed from the older civilizations they lived among and were sometimes conquered by, these are legitimate historical questions with genuine evidence attached to them. Not certainties, possibilities, threads worth following, and the best place to start following them is at the beginning. Not the biblical beginning, but the older one. Back in the river valley, in the world that invented writing partly so it could remember its own stories. Let's go there slowly. Before we get to the tablets themselves, it helps to sit with the Genesis story for a moment and actually look at what it's doing. Not what we've been told it means, not the Sunday school version, or the moral lesson extracted from it in 1,000 sermons, but the raw architecture of the narrative. Because when you look at it that way, something interesting happens. The story becomes stranger and more open than its reputation suggests. Here is what Genesis actually gives us. Two brothers, sons of Adam and Eve, living after the expulsion from Eden. Cain works the ground. Abel keeps flocks. Both of them bring offerings to God. Cain brings fruit of the soil. Abel brings fat portions from the firstborn of his flock. God looks with favour on Abel's offering. God does not look with favour on Cain's. No explanation is given. Cain becomes angry. His face falls. God speaks to him, asking why he's angry, telling him that if he does what is right he will be accepted, and warning him that sin is crouching at the door. Then, in a verse that some translations render with remarkable abruptness, Cain says something to Abel. They go out to a field, and Cain kills him. God asks where Abel is. Cain gives the answer that has echoed through literature for 3,000 years. Am I my brother's keeper? God tells Cain the ground will no longer yield its strength to him. He will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain says the punishment is more than he can bear, that whoever finds him will kill him. God places a mark on Cain. Anyone who kills him will suffer sevenfold vengeance. And Cain goes east of Eden, to a land called Nod, where he builds a city. That's the skeleton. And the moment you lay it out that plainly, the gaps and the tensions become visible. The most immediate one is the rejected offering. The text gives no reason. Some later interpreters filled the silence by suggesting Abel's offering was from the firstborn, the best of what he had, while Cain's offering was simply from the soil without that qualifier. Maybe Cain held something back. Maybe his intent was different. The rabbinical tradition spent centuries working on this question. Christian theology developed its own answers, but the text itself doesn't say. It presents the rejection as a fact and then watches what Cain does with it. Which is to say the story is less interested in the theology of acceptable sacrifice than it is in the psychology of what happens when someone feels passed over. The inciting incident is favour. Not sin, not transgression, but the perception that someone else was chosen and you were not. That's what cracks Cain open. Then there's the warning God gives him before anything goes wrong. The language is extraordinary. Sin is crouching at the door. It desires you, but you must rule over it. This is moral agency presented with almost startling directness. Cain is not a passive figure being swept along by fate. He is being told explicitly that what happens next is a choice. The story knows he has options. It tells him so. And then it watches him choose anyway. That structure, the warning given and ignored, the door left open to the wrong thing, is not incidental to the story. It is the story. The murder is almost a secondary event. What the narrative is really tracking is the moment between warning and action, the space where a human being decides. After the murder, the story shifts into consequence and exile. The ground is cursed against Cain specifically. He will wander. He will not belong anywhere. And then something that tends to surprise people when they read it carefully. Cain is afraid of being killed, and God protects him. The mark placed on Cain is not a punishment. It's a protection. Whatever it looked like, whatever it meant in the original context, its function in the text is to keep Cain alive. And then Cain goes to Nod and builds a city, has descendants, and those descendants invent things. Musical instruments, metalworking. The text gives Cain's line the credit for cultural innovation, which is a deeply strange thing to do with a murderer if the story's only point is moral condemnation. This is where origin questions start to surface naturally, because the pastoral and agricultural imagery in the story is doing more work than simple scene setting. Cain the farmer and Abel the shepherd are not just two different jobs. In the ancient Near East, they represent two different ways of organizing human life. Two different relationships to land, to movement, to ownership, to the divine. Pastoral and agricultural communities had real, documented tensions. Herders and farmers competed for the same land. The question of whose offerings were more acceptable to the gods, whose way of life was more divinely favoured, was not abstract theology. It was a live social question with economic and political stakes. When you understand that, the story starts to feel less like a family drama and more like a cultural argument wearing family drama as a disguise. Now, later interpretation is worth acknowledging here, because most of us don't encounter this story as a blank text. We encounter it through layers, through Augustine and Aquinas, through Milton, through centuries of Christian and Jewish commentary that read Cain as the archetype of the sinner, the first murderer, the man whose descendants carry a kind of spiritual darkness. In some traditions, Cain became a symbol of everything outside the covenant, the wanderer, the builder of earthly cities as opposed to the city of God. That reading is coherent and has its own internal logic, but it's a reading built over the text, not simply extracted from it. And one of the things that comparative mythology does is help strip those accumulated layers back, not to dismiss them, but to see what was underneath before they settled. When you clear away 1,500 years of interpretation, the original story is more ambiguous, more open, and in some ways more interesting. The villain is more sympathetic, the victim is barely characterized, the divine is hard to read. The city Cain builds at the end doesn't feel like a warning, it feels like a fact. Which brings us to what scholars mean when they use the word parallel, because this word gets used loosely and it matters to be precise about it. A parallel in comparative mythology does not mean identical. It does not mean one story is the source of the other. It means two narratives share enough structural or thematic features that the resemblance is probably not coincidental, that it points toward either a common ancestor story, a shared cultural environment, or a process of transmission that carried certain images and patterns from one tradition into another. The parallel might be in the plot, it might be in the imagery, it might be in the social tension the story is trying to process, it might be in the ritual logic underlying a scene. Any of these connections can be meaningful. None of them requires the conclusion that a scribe in Jerusalem copied a tablet from Nippur. What comparative mythology actually tells you, when it's done carefully, is something about what human beings keep reaching for when they try to explain certain kinds of pain. The pain of feeling unchosen, the tension between different ways of living, the question of what happens to someone who does something irreversible. These are not questions that belong to one culture. They're questions that every culture has to answer, and the answers tend to rhyme even across enormous distances of time and geography. The Sumerian material reaches toward the same cluster of questions, and the way it does that, the specific images it uses, the social tensions it encodes, the ritual logic underneath the offerings, all of that is old enough and close enough to the Genesis story that it demands a second look. So that's what we're going to give it, a slow, careful second look, starting with how those clay tablets survived at all and what kind of world produced them, because that world is not a backdrop. It's the whole point. If you picture ancient texts, you might imagine scrolls in dusty libraries or leather-bound books on shelves somewhere under a temple. The Sumerians didn't do that. Their books were mud. A Sumerian page starts with someone walking down to a riverbank and picking up clay. They knead it with their hands until it's soft and smooth, then shape it into a small pillow, or a long rectangle, or a little lentil-shaped disc. While the clay is still damp, they take a reed cut to a chisel point and press it in, over and over, in hundreds of tiny wedge-shaped impressions. That's what cuneiform means, wedge writing. When they're done, if the text matters, they dry the tablet in the sun or fire it in a kiln. Once that happens, it's basically a ceramic sherd with words baked into it. Heavy, breakable, almost weirdly durable. A scroll will rot if you forget about it for a century. A fired clay tablet, if it's lucky, can sit in a collapsed archive for 4,000 years and still be legible when someone digs it up. That someone is rarely a single heroic archaeologist brushing off a single precious tablet. In reality, tablets come to us in messy clusters. They come from cities that fell and burned, from palaces that collapsed, from temple storerooms that were sacked and then buried under later buildings. They come from controlled excavations, where archaeologists record which room and which layer each fragment came from. And they also come, uncomfortably, from looters' pits and 19th century market stalls, where local diggers sold handfuls of clay pieces to European and American buyers for cash. So when you see a Sumerian text in a museum case in London, or Berlin or Istanbul, you're seeing the survivor of multiple catastrophes. First, the city had to be destroyed or abandoned in just the right way. The building had to fall in on the shelves, sealing the tablets instead of grinding them to powder. Then, centuries later, someone had to care enough to dig there, to pick up those funny inscribed bricks instead of tossing them aside, and to ship them halfway across the world. And finally, they had to end up somewhere that could store and catalogue them. A national museum, a university collection, sometimes a private archive that later got donated. That means the Sumerian tablets people talk about online are not one neat bookshelf of stories. They're hundreds of thousands of clay pieces spread across the globe. Big institutions like the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Museum in Istanbul, university collections from Chicago to Philadelphia to Yale, regional museums in Iraq and Syria and Iran. Most of those tablets are not on display. They sit in drawers, in boxes, in compact shelving, each one with a museum number and a little card saying where it was found, if anyone knows. On those tablets, the writing system is the same basic wedge script, but the language isn't always the same. The oldest myths and hymns we're interested in here are usually written in Sumerian, a language that doesn't seem to be related to any living tongue. Later copies of those same stories can appear in Akkadian, a Semitic language more distantly connected to Hebrew and Arabic. Sometimes a single tablet will give you the Sumerian line and the Akkadian equivalent underneath, or in a parallel column, because it was a school exercise for trainee scribes. Those scribal schools are crucial. They're the reason any of this survives. In temple complexes and palace precincts, young scribes sat day after day copying proverbs, legal formulas, king lists, and eventually myths. They wrote on practice tablets that were meant to be erased and reused, and on nicer tablets that were stored in archives. Their curriculum had standard texts. That is why we often have multiple copies of the same composition from different cities and different centuries. Every time a scribe in Nippur or Uruk copied a hymn, they were accidentally increasing the odds that some version of it would make it through to us. But if that makes it sound like we have these texts in clean, book-like form, we don't. Clay breaks. Shelves collapse. A tablet that once fit neatly in your hand can be shattered into a dozen or 100 pieces. Some of those pieces are lost forever. Some are still in the ground. Some get scooped up by one expedition and stored in London, while another shard from the same original tablet ends up in Istanbul or Baghdad. When scholars talk about fragments, this is what they mean: broken edges, missing lines, orphaned corners whose original context has vanished. That's why the published version of a Sumerian poem is often a reconstruction. A scholar looks at half a tablet from one site, recognizes the text, then realizes a little corner in another museum completes line 12, and a third fragment from an old dig fills in lines 20 to 25. They publish a composite labelled line by line with which museum piece is being used. If another fragment turns up 10 years later that changes the reading of line 7, the translation has to shift with it. So how do they get from those wedges and fragments to the English sentences you and I can read? First, they learn the signs. Cuneiform is not an alphabet. Each wedge cluster can stand for a syllable, or a whole word, or an idea sign. The same sign can be read in different ways depending on context. So there are sign lists, catalogues of all the known wedge patterns, their possible values, and where they appear. A specialist in Sumerian spends years just getting fluent in those lists. Then there is grammar. Sumerian structure is very different from English or Hebrew. Verbs can carry a lot of information. Noun phrases can be marked for case in ways that don't map neatly onto modern languages. Akkadian has its own complexities, verb stems, prefixes, a Semitic root system that looks familiar if you know Hebrew, but behaves differently. Translating is not just swapping words, it's reconstructing an underlying grammar and then trying to express it in a modern tongue without lying too much. Context does a lot of heavy lifting. If a fragment comes from a temple archive and uses language similar to other hymns, it's probably a hymn. If it comes from a schoolroom with lots of exercise tablets, it might be a student copy, complete with mistakes. Parallels help too. If we have 6 manuscripts of the same myth, each with slightly different wording and slightly different gaps, scholars can compare them to guess what the missing bits in any one copy probably said. Sometimes they're sure. Sometimes all they can do is bracket a reconstruction with a question mark. All of that work makes the tablets feel more secure than they really are when they reach the public. By the time a translation appears on a website or in a coffee table book, the footnotes, the uncertainties, the broken edges are often invisible. That's where the trouble begins. Pop claims about what the Sumerian tablets really say often lean on 3 habits. The first is cherry-picking. Someone will grab one dramatic line from a much longer composition, ignore the rest of the story, and present that one sentence as if it represents the whole. The second is mistranslation, sometimes innocent, sometimes not. A single word with 2 possible meanings will be rendered in the most sensational way, even if that's not what most specialists think it means in that context. The third is invention. Lines that are fragmentary or uncertain quietly get filled in with details that are not actually there on the clay at all. So when we talk about Sumerian parallels to Cain and Abel, it matters that we remember the clay. The broken edges, the half lines, the scribal exercises, the slow, patient work of sign lists and grammars. We are not reading a tidy shelf of ancient novels. We are listening through ruin to voices that were never written with us in mind. Once you know that, the world those tablets came from starts to feel less like a set of sources for the Bible and more like its own living landscape. A landscape of cities, temples, canals and fields, where stories about farmers and shepherds and divine favour were already in the air long before anyone in Israel put them into Hebrew. And that is where we're going next. Imagine walking out of one of those temple schoolrooms, leaving the shelves of tablets behind, and stepping into the city that surrounded them. This is Sumer in its own world, before it was a background for anyone else's scriptures, just a place where people were trying to keep food coming, gods happy, and neighbours in line. The first thing that would strike you is water, not gentle garden streams, but two massive river systems that didn't always behave, the Tigris and the Euphrates, plus a lacework of canals, ditches, embankments and drainage channels that human hands had carved into the floodplain. The land itself was a paradox. The southern Mesopotamian plain was flat, hot, and mostly treeless. Rainfall was unreliable, but the rivers could be devastating. In a bad year, the water stayed in its bed and the fields withered. In a worse year, the rivers overran their banks at the wrong time, stripped away topsoil, drowned seedlings, and left behind layers of silt and salt. To live here at all, you had to reshape the landscape. You dig a canal from the river, then divide it into smaller channels, each one leading to a field. You build raised embankments and little gates you can open and close. You clear the silt every year. You watch the level of the water, the colour of the soil, the first hints of salt crusting on top. Irrigation wasn't a one-time engineering project. It was a constant negotiation with mud. Out of that mud, cities rose. Not skyscrapers, but dense clusters of mud brick houses around towering temple platforms. Each city was its own little world, with a name, a patron god, and a sense of itself as a state. Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Ummah. They shared a culture and a writing system, but they were politically independent. When we call them city-states, we're not being poetic. Each one had its own ruler, its own walls, its own tax system, its own troops. At the centre, physically and economically, stood the temple. A temple wasn't just a place to mumble prayers. It was a household, and in Sumer, households were the basic unit of everything. A household meant a group tied to a central storehouse, grain jars, wool bales, oil, tools, animals. Around that core you had the people, the male head of the house, his wife, children, maybe married sons with their own families, aunts, cousins, in-laws, servants, sometimes slaves. Everyone ate from the same stocks. Everyone's labour in theory served the same collective. Scale that up and you have a temple household. Its head was the deity Inanna, Enlil, Ningersu, whoever held the local top job, and under the god you had priests, managers, scribes and labourers of every kind. The temple owned fields and flocks. It issued rations. It hired and lent out workers. It could be landlord, employer, money lender, and charity office at the same time. Food, the most basic business of all, came from two main systems that constantly rubbed against each other: grain agriculture and herding. On the one hand, irrigated grain. Barley most of all. In this environment, barley was king because it tolerated salt and harsh conditions better than wheat. To get a barley harvest, you had to coordinate large teams, men to dig and clean canals, people to flood and drain the fields at exactly the right moment. Sowers, weeders, harvesters, threshers, millers. The work was back-breaking and seasonal. During peak times you needed extra hands, so the temple or palace might draft people from dependent villages or hire labourers who were already in debt. On the other hand, animals, sheep and goats on the edges of the fields, grazing the stubble after harvest, wandering out onto the steplands beyond the canals. Herding needed fewer people at any one moment, but those people had to be mobile, attentive, and willing to spend weeks or months away from the main settlements. They followed pasture, watched for predators and thieves, calculated births and losses. Their wealth was on 4 legs and could wander off or die in a single bad season. Both systems fed into the same urban economy, but they implied different ways of living. Farmers were rooted, tied to square parcels of irrigated land that had to be maintained and defended. Herders were semi-mobile, operating in a looser matrix of routes and grazing rights. The tablets remember these tensions in dry ways: ration lists, contracts for wool deliveries, arguments over pasture. But in the background you can feel different identities taking shape: the settled cultivator and the man of the flocks. Within the cities, social structure stacked on top of those basic economic roles. Most people belong to some kind of household headed by a female citizen, a farmer with his plot, an artisan with his workshop, a lower-level temple employee. Attached to these households were dependents, women and children, of course, but also hired workers paid in grain, debtors temporarily bound to work off what they owed, and enslaved people captured in war or born into servitude. Even the poorest free man had a place in the web of obligations. He owed labour or military service to a superior, and in return expected protection, access to water, maybe a share of temple grain in hard times. Above them stood the elites: high priests, leading merchants, major landholders, city rulers with titles that shifted over the centuries: Lugal, Ensi, En. They controlled large estates, directed temple labour, commanded troops, and had their conflicts recorded in the very tablets we read. Their marriages were political. Their children's inheritance shaped maps. The temple cut across these ranks. A woman might be dedicated as a priestess and gain status and resources she wouldn't have had as a regular wife. A man from a modest family might rise as a scribe or administrator, but the temple was also a machine for concentrating power. If you controlled access to the god and to the god's granaries, you had leverage over everyone who depended on those stores in years of famine. In a setting like this, disagreement wasn't an abstract moral problem. It was a threat to the flow of resources. Violence was always in the background. We don't have police reports from Sumer, but we do have legal texts and letters that hint at daily conflicts: assaults, thefts, property disputes, injuries, killings. The default response in small communities is the feud. Your cousin injures my brother, my family retaliates, your family escalates, and suddenly the whole network is at risk. Sumerian cities lived close enough together and depended enough on shared canals that open feuding could spiral quickly. So, slowly, they developed ways to channel it. Some of our earliest texts record oaths and ordeals. If you say X, swear before the god, or submit to the river ordeal and let the deity decide. Others lay out patterns of compensation. If someone knocks out your tooth, they don't lose a tooth in turn. They pay a set amount of silver or grain. If an ox destroys a neighbour's field, the owner is liable. If someone is killed, sometimes the remedy is blood. Sometimes it is a payment the community recognises as enough to stop the cycle. This isn't law, yet in the formal, codified sense we meet later in Babylon, but the thinking is there. People are trying to put prices and procedures on injury, to translate chaotic vengeance into predictable outcomes. They're asking, what is a life worth in animals, in silver, in grain, in service? All of this, water, grain, wool, households, temples, feuds, compensations, creates a world where status and inheritance feel dangerously fragile. Land doesn't stretch forever. Canal water has to be divided. Flocks can only graze so much pasture. A father with several sons can't simply give each one an equal share of everything without risking the long-term survival of the estate. So some sons get more, some less. Some stay in the main house, some marry out. Some are dedicated to temple service. Some end up effectively disinherited. In such a system, sibling rivalry isn't a psychological quirk. It's built into the structure. Who gets which field? Who inherits the team of oxen? Who takes over the father's position as head of household, or temple official, or local leader? Who gets the god's attention, and who is left with the leftovers? Sumerian texts talk about these tensions in practical ways: division of property, contracts, disputes. But they also surface in stories and songs. Brothers compete, friends fall out, gods favour one worshipper over another. The emotional charge behind those tales comes from a very concrete fear that in the next generation's accounting, you or your children will be the ones pushed to the margins. By the time later cultures began telling stories about a farmer and a shepherd struggling over divine favour, that background was already ancient. Sumer had spent centuries wrestling with the problem of how to divide land, labour, and love among people who all thought they deserved more. To see what that looks like at the level of altars and offerings, we have to watch how these cities tried to feed their gods. To start, we have to adjust one modern assumption. When you imagine an offering, you might picture a person standing alone, holding out a gift in their hands, waiting for an answer. In Mesopotamia, most offerings weren't like that. They were more like the weekly shopping list and payroll of a very demanding invisible employer. The gods, in theory, owned everything. Fields, flocks, canals, brick kilns, workshops, all of it ultimately belonged to the divine landlord. Human beings ran the estate. Their side of the bargain was simple to say, exhausting to live. Keep the god's house supplied. Offerings were the god's allotted share of the output of the land and its animals. Barley and beer, bread and cakes, sheep and goats, sometimes cattle, jars of oil, dates, onions, pulses when available, incense and aromatic woods for smoke, which mattered a lot in a world where everyone believed smells travelled between realms. And not just things. Work itself could be an offering. A woman weaving for the temple could be listed in a text as serving the god. A man repairing a canal under temple authority might be described as performing the work of Enlil or Inanna. Many of these offerings were highly standardized. Tablets list daily rations for gods the way they list rations for humans. So many loaves at dawn, so much beer at midday, meat and sweets for festivals. The god of a major city could have a diet that looks, on clay, like that of a small palace. The logic behind it was reciprocity, not charity. Humans feed the gods. In return, the gods keep the world from unravelling. In this way of thinking, the cosmos is not a machine you can walk away from. It's a household you have to keep running. If the gods' meals are regular, the river might rise at the right time, the canals might hold, the barley might sprout. If you neglect the god, skip the offerings, cheat on the temple share, let the statue's clothes get shabby, you're not just being rude, you're endangering the entire social and natural order. Sumerian and later Akkadian texts lean into this. Hymns praise a deity for making firm the foundations of heaven and earth, for stabilizing kingship, for guarding boundaries. Laments for destroyed cities describe a nightmare scenario. Temple fires gone out, food bowls overturned, no one bringing bread, no one pouring beer. The result is not just empty sanctuaries, it's failed crops, invading armies, pestilence. The god withdraws favour, and the world follows. But this isn't a simple slot machine where you put in grain and get out good harvests. People knew very intimately that you could perform every ritual correctly and still lose a child, still have a field flooded, still watch a flock get sick. So they developed an entire language of signs to interpret how the gods were feeling. Omens were everywhere. A series of eclipses, an odd birth in the herd, the pattern of oil on water, the way smoke twisted from incense. Each could be read as a line of commentary from the divine realm. There were specialists whose whole job was to read those lines. They compiled huge series of if-then statements on tablets. If a sheep is born with such and such defect, then it means danger for the king. If the liver of a sacrificial animal shows a particular mark, then the god is angry about some offence. Misfortune itself could be a message. A man whose business suddenly failed, or whose household was struck by illness, might describe it as the hand of the god upon him. Not always punishment exactly, but a sign something was out of alignment. Maybe a vow had been neglected. Maybe a ritual was performed incorrectly. Maybe some hidden wrong had finally come due. The response was often more ritual. Additional offerings, special prayers, substitution sacrifices in which an animal or a symbolic stand-in took on the person's danger. Sometimes it meant going to a diviner to ask, which god is displeased? What specifically have I done? The underlying assumption is steady. The divine will is knowable in principle, even if decoding it is hard work. All of this might sound very institutional, very temple-heavy, and at the city level it was. But temple ritual wasn't the only religious game in town. You have to picture two overlapping systems. On the one hand, there is official cult. This is the temple as we left it, an enormous household with its own lands, workshops, and staff. Its rituals are scheduled and public. The god statue is bathed, clothed, perfumed, presented with meals. Musicians and singers perform hymns written by temple scribes. Festive processions carry the deity out into the city or to visit another god's shrine. The offerings here are large-scale and collective. The city as a whole, represented by its rulers and priests, is feeding its patron. On the other hand, there is household piety. Most people never get close to the inner sanctum of a major temple. Their daily religious life centers on smaller shrines in their own homes. A corner with a little niche, a clay plaque, a figurine of a protective god or goddess, an ancestor statue. Offerings in this space are modest. A bit of bread, a pour of beer or water, a lamp left burning, a whispered request before sleep. Sometimes the same divine names show up in both levels. A family might offer privately to Inanna or Shamash, deities who also have great temples, but there are also local spirits, healing gods, family protectors who live mostly in household practice and in small neighborhood shrines. The lines blur. A personal god could be imagined as a sort of spiritual patron who speaks on your behalf to the higher, more distant great gods. This means there are at least two kinds of favor in play. There is the fate of the city and kingdom. Will the canals hold? Will enemy armies be turned back? Which depends on the temple's proper functioning. And there is the fate of the individual or family. Will this pregnancy go well? Will that lawsuit succeed? Which seems to depend on a patchwork of temple support, personal piety, and luck. When we later encounter stories in which one offering is accepted and another is not, it is tempting to picture a bright yes-no signal from heaven. But Mesopotamian sources are rarely that clear. How did people even know an offering was accepted? Sometimes texts imagine dramatic signs, smoke rising straight up, an omen turning out favorable, a dream in which the god speaks. More often, acceptance is inferred over time. If your fields prosper, your children survive, your ventures succeed, people may say the god regarded your offering, or set his eye favorably upon you. If disasters stack up, you may conclude, rightly or wrongly, that something was wrong with your gifts, or your behaviour, or simply your luck in the divine lottery. Language adds another layer of ambiguity. The verbs used for divine reception, see, lift the hand toward, smell, turn the face to, aren't mechanical terms, they're relational. A god turns his face away from a city when it is doomed. A goddess keeps her eyes on a king she favours. Whether that favour is keyed to specific offerings, to moral behaviour, to political decisions, or to inscrutable divine mood is often left undefined. Later cultures looking back at this world would compress all this complexity into short phrases. The sacrifice was accepted, the offering displeased the god. But in the Mesopotamian setting itself, those judgments lived inside a thick web of ritual, omen reading, personal misfortune and collective experience. To see why the kind of offering might matter, grain from fields, animals from flocks, we have to look more closely at how Mesopotamians imagined the people who brought those gifts, and what it meant for a farmer or a shepherd to stand at the edge of the divine table. In the texts, farmer and shepherd can look like simple job titles. A guy who grows grain, a guy who watches sheep. But those words were doing much heavier work. In southern Mesopotamia, fields and flocks depended on each other. Irrigated agriculture needed manure, wool, hides, animal traction. Pastoralists needed grain, beer, and access to canal water and stubble pasture. One group spent most of its time anchored to canals and city walls. The other moved with animals following grazing routes, sometimes well beyond the edges of permanent settlement. So from the start there's a built-in push and pull, cooperation, because each side literally feeds the other. Tension, because land and water are finite, and animals do what animals do. A herd on the wrong side of a boundary can turn someone's carefully tended barley into chewed stems overnight. Some of the earliest legal and administrative tablets are quietly obsessed with this. They write down where canals run, who is responsible for which section of levee, what happens if a neighbour's animals damage a field, how many sheep are supposed to be delivered to the temple from outlying herds. These aren't laws in the modern sense so much as written memories of recurring friction points. Behind the numbers is a social map. People tied to fields, dikes, and fixed plots. People tied to herds, tracks, and seasonal movement. Each group looking slightly sideways at the other. Ancient stories pick this up and turn it into shorthand. A farmer on a tablet is rarely just someone who grows edibles. He represents the settled, the canal user, the taxpayer, the person who can be summoned to corvée labour to dig mud and haul reeds. A shepherd is rarely just someone who knows how to deliver a lamb. He often carries connotations of the mobile, the liminal, the person who might slip in and out of city control. At the same time, a shepherd is one of the most exalted metaphors for kingship in Mesopotamia. Gods are called shepherds. Kings are called shepherds. Deities pasture peoples the way a human shepherd pastures sheep. The image emphasizes care, guidance, responsibility for vulnerable beings. So in one context, shepherd can sound wild, risky, on the margins. In another, it is the most dignified way to describe rule. Farmer imagery has its own ambivalence. On one level, the farmer stands for the backbone of the city's prosperity. The one who turns mud and water into grain, who stabilizes the food supply, who turns offerings into something you can actually put in a bowl. Sumerian hymns praise gods as great irrigators, canal openers, boundary markers. They give deities the credit for the farmer's world, but that only works because the farmer's world is already central and prestigious. On another level, the farmer can symbolize the constrained, the earth-grubbing, the person loaded with obligations to temple and palace. When a text wants to evoke someone overburdened, bowed under the weight of work, it will sometimes reach for imagery from agriculture, bent backs, muddy feet, endless channels. So you have this double coding. Each occupation is necessary and sometimes honoured, but each can also be framed in a less flattering way. The same double coding appears in how texts draw a line between civilized and wild. Cuneiform sources don't map perfectly onto our categories, but they do talk about people of the steppe, of the city, of the reed marsh, of the mountain. Each landscape comes with stereotypes. Steppe and pasture people can be praised as courageous, hardy, closer to the gods of sky and storm. They can also be painted as raiders, those who do not know grain, those who eat meat raw, those who live in tents instead of houses of brick. Field and canal people can be praised as orderly, law-abiding, wise in water management, able to build temples and keep festivals on a schedule. They can also be dismissed as soft, as bound to their dikes, as dependent on a whole apparatus of labourers, officials and scribes. Myths and hymns play with these images. A god associated with earth and canals might be cast as the orderly farmer figure. A god associated with storms or fertility might be cast as the shepherd figure. When those gods quarrel in stories, the debate often tracks real social questions. Do you value the stability of fields more or the flexibility of herds? Is true wealth in granaries or in flocks that can move when the climate turns? Land sits underneath all of this like a quiet pressure. Irrigated plots in the south were not easily replaced. You can't just pick up your canal and move it if your neighbour annoys you. It takes years of labour to dig, line and maintain channels, to build up soil texture, to arrange tenancy and temple dues. That investment makes land a magnet for identity. Families and institutions define themselves through fields they have held for generations, through specific tracts mentioned in contracts and boundary stones. Flocks are different. They are mobile, but also vulnerable in other ways. Drought, disease, theft and predation can erase them in a season. Their very mobility, though, means that pastoralists may feel less tied to a particular patch of ground, and more tied to routes, water points, seasonal agreements with farmers to graze crop stubble. Identity forms not just around a village, but around a circuit. When those two patterns meet, it's easy for ordinary negotiations, who gets which water at which time, when the flocks can graze the fallow field, who pays for a damaged canal bank, to pick up symbolic weight. The farmer can come to see the shepherd as someone who benefits from carefully maintained infrastructure without fully sharing its burdens. The shepherd can see the farmer as someone who tries to freeze what should be flexible, to fence off what should be shared, to treat open land as private property. Labour is the other axis. Agricultural work is synchronized, seasonal and intense. There are windows where everything depends on coordinated effort. Sowing, weeding, harvesting. Temples and palaces harness that through corvée. Days and months of compulsory labour. Those systems, and the tablets that record them, give agriculture a bureaucratic footprint in the archive that herding rarely has. Pastoral labour is also demanding, but it disperses across time and space, watching flocks, moving them, facing long, lonely stretches away from the city. That kind of work leaves fewer clay records. It shows up instead in mythic images, the lone figure in the steppe, the shepherd god scouting the horizon, the king leading out his people as if they were sheep. Because our evidence is so uneven, there's a temptation to project later, sharper divisions onto this world. Nomad versus settler, city versus desert, barbarian versus farmer. Those labels come from much later texts and different political landscapes. In early and mid-Bronze Age Mesopotamia, the boundaries are softer. Many households may have had a foot in both worlds, some fields, some animals. Seasonal shifts between more settled and more mobile life. When myths contrast farmer and shepherd, they are often exaggerating real tensions to make a point, not describing airtight social classes, The shepherd in a story may represent one pole of a spectrum, not a completely separate tribe. The farmer, the other pole, still the emotional charge is there. Occupation becomes a way to talk about character. A person can be like a farmer, steady, dutiful, predictable, or, like a shepherd, restless, daring, maybe unreliable. The same text can invert those qualities depending on what it wants to praise or criticize. So when a narrative later sets a farmer and a shepherd side by side, it is pulling on a deep reservoir of associations, cooperation and rivalry, city and steppe, stability and movement, dependence on a fixed plot versus dependence on living animals. To see just how deliberately that contrast could be used, we can look at a Sumerian story where those roles are not background but the whole point. A god of the flocks and a god of the fields arguing over who deserves the goddess's favour. In that story, the contrast doesn't just sit in the background, it walks on stage and starts talking. The text is usually called Dumuzi and Enkimdu. Sometimes scholars translate it as the dispute between the shepherd and the farmer. It's short, playful, and in some ways surprisingly gentle. The basic cast is simple. Dumuzi is the shepherd. He's associated with flocks, milk, lambs, and a kind of youthful, erotic energy. Later tradition will remember him as Inanna's beloved, the dying and rising shepherd god. Enkimdu is the farmer. His domain is canals, furrows, irrigation ditches, stacks of grain. He's the god figure of the plough and the levee, the one who tames mud and water into bread. And in the middle stands Inanna. In the version we have, the story opens with a kind of courtship contest. Inanna is being wooed. Dumuzi wants her. Enkimdu also wants her. Each suitor steps forward and starts listing what he can offer. That's our first key motif, gifts and offerings. Enkimdu, the farmer, speaks the language of stability. He promises Inanna well-watered fields, barley as high as the thigh, walls of grain piled up in her storehouses. He talks about canals dug straight, embankments in good repair, furrows that will never lack water. His gifts aren't flashy. They are steady. Bread, beer, regular surplus, the kind of wealth you can record on a tablet and collect in temple yards. Dumuzi, the shepherd, counters with movement and abundance of a different sort. He offers milk in every container, cheese of all kinds, fat sheep and lambs, fleeces, kids, cream. He paints pictures of flocks streaming toward the fold, of animals fattened on good pasture. Where Enkimdu talks about straight lines and fixed channels, Dumuzi talks about flowing herds and overflowing milk. Both of them are, in a sense, making offerings, not on an altar this time, but to a goddess as potential wife. Each is saying, "Choose me, and this is the kind of life, the kind of provisioning, the kind of world you will get." The rivalry grows out of that comparison. It's not rage at first, it's persuasion. Inanna listens to Enkimdu's promises and seems inclined toward him. She likes the idea of fields, canals, the secure food base a farmer can provide. At this stage of the text, the farmer actually looks like he's winning. The city goddess leaning toward the field god, the irrigation specialist. It makes sense in an economy where temple storehouses depend heavily on grain. Dumuzi doesn't take that quietly. He starts boasting. He tries to undercut Enkimdu's claims. He argues that his gifts are richer, more diverse, more immediately satisfying. He insists that milk and wool and meat are just as valuable, even more valuable than barley and beer. This is social valuation in poetic form. The story is really asking, which kind of wealth matters most? The cool, counted, easily taxed grain coming in sacks and measures, or the more fluid, harder to control wealth of living animals? Inanna becomes the arbiter of that question. Her choice is a kind of divine verdict. Depending on the reconstruction, the speech patterns can get heated. Dumuzi mocks Enkimdu as slow, earthbound, tied to his dikes. Enkimdu at first responds with self-deprecation, almost humility. He concedes that Dumuzi will probably win the goddess. He offers to provide Dumuzi with grain and beer anyway, to keep up good relations. The farmer, in other words, steps back from direct competition and suggests cooperation. This is where the story does something interesting. It diffuses the rivalry instead of sharpening it. In the end, Inanna chooses Dumuzi. The shepherd gets the girl. The flocks win divine favour in a very literal way. The goddess of love and war picks the mobile, youthful pastoral figure as her husband. But the farmer is not destroyed, cursed or erased. Enkimdu doesn't get pushed off the map. Instead, he shifts role. He becomes the ally who will supply grain to Dumuzi's house, the neighbour with whom the victorious shepherd makes peace. The narrative resolves with an agreement rather than a murder. So what does that resolution suggest about favour and selection in this older mythic world? First, favour isn't a one-time, absolute judgment on a person's worth. Inanna's preference for Dumuzi as a lover doesn't mean Enkimdu is useless or despised. Her choice selects one suitor for a particular role, but the other still has a place in the cosmic economy. Second, divine favour doesn't erase interdependence. Even with Dumuzi in the spotlight, the text quietly reaffirms that flocks still need fields. The shepherd who wins still relies on the farmer's barley to feed his household and probably his animals. The social reality that agriculture and pastoralism are intertwined sneaks back into the story at the end. Third, the competition is framed as argument and persuasion, not as a prelude to violence. The sharpest weapons here are words, boasts, promises, and a certain amount of trash talk. The way you win favour is by making a better case, by offering better gifts, by convincing the goddess you can provide more. If we lay this Sumerian story alongside the Cain and Abel narrative, some parallels are hard to miss. In both, you have two figures representing the same occupational poles, one tied to animals, one tied to cultivated land. In both, a higher power evaluates them. In both, someone ends up favoured. Dumuzi is chosen by Inanna. Abel's offering is regarded in Genesis. In both, the stakes are not trivial. Divine attention, honour, perhaps a kind of status are on the line. The language of gifts and offerings overlaps too. Cain and Abel bring offerings to YHWH. Dumuzi and Enkimdu present what they can give Inanna. Grain versus animal products, fields versus flocks. On the surface, it looks like a familiar pattern. Two producers, one divine figure, a preference expressed. But the differences matter just as much. The most obvious is that no one dies in the Sumerian story. There is no fratricide, no curse of exile. Enkimdu doesn't rise up against Dumuzi with a weapon in the fields. Instead, he makes peace, offers his cooperation, and the tension drains away into a compromise. The contest ends in integration, not rupture. The tone is also lighter. Dumuzi and Enkimdu reads more like a debate poem, a kind of mythic argument designed to amuse and to explore values, than like a tragic origin of murder. There is rivalry, even a hint of insult, but the myth doesn't turn that emotional spark into bloodshed. Another difference is what the divine choice seems to be commenting on. In Genesis, the narrative voice is spare. It doesn't explicitly say why one offering is accepted and the other is not, and later, readers fill that silence with moral and theological theories. In the Sumerian text, the criteria are foregrounded. Each suitor explains exactly why his domain is valuable. The story is transparently about economic and social valuation, the relative worth of flocks versus fields, of mobile pastoral wealth versus stationary agricultural wealth, seen through the eyes of a city goddess. Because of those differences, most scholars hesitate to draw a straight line between Dumuzi and Enkimdu and Cain and Abel. The Sumerian story isn't a direct prototype for the biblical one. It's not a one-to-one original version later edited into something darker. The tablets we have are copies from various periods, not a single Hua text, and there is no clear textual chain carrying this specific debate poem into early Israelite tradition. What we can say more responsibly is that they share a thematic pattern. Ancient Mesopotamian culture already had a habit of staging arguments between contrasting professions, farmer and shepherd, bird and fish, tree and reed, to think through social questions. The farmer-shepherd opposition was a known tool in the mythic toolkit long before anyone wrote Genesis. So when a much later Hebrew writer places a farmer and a shepherd side by side and has God look differently on their offerings, that writer is working within a very old conversation. The Cain and Abel story might not be copying Dumuzi and Enkimdu, but it seems to echo the same deep concerns. How different ways of making a living are valued, how divine favour interacts with social roles, what happens when one side feels slighted. And in that echo, one crucial change stands out. The older Sumerian myth lets rivalry be resolved by words and accommodation. The biblical story lets the resentment run all the way to the first human bloodshed. To see what that change might mean, and how other ancient stories handle similar tensions without a biblical frame, we have to step sideways into more Mesopotamian myths where brothers fight, argue, and sometimes reconcile, with no Cain or Abel in sight. If we leave Cain and Abel off the table for a moment and just listen to Mesopotamian stories on their own terms, a different picture begins to emerge. The first thing you notice is that brother is a very flexible word. Sometimes it means literal sibling. Sometimes it means political ally, or rival king, or neighbouring city that you trade with and occasionally threaten to burn down. In diplomatic letters from later periods, rulers call each other my brother as a way of signalling equality, even when that equality is aspirational. Myth and epic pick up that same vocabulary. Take the gods Anu and Enlil, for example. In some lists they're father and son, in others they're framed more like cosmic peers. Authority passes between them in ways that feel a lot like succession in a royal house. Enlil is the great mountain, the one whose word shapes fates. When younger gods chafe under the workload in some creation myths, they complain as if they were overburdened sons in a powerful family. Order is maintained, but the potential for revolt is never entirely absent. Or think about Enki and his complicated network of kin. He's a god of wisdom, fresh water, and crafty solutions. In one story about the distribution of the me, the divine decrees that govern culture and civilization, Enki gets drunk and hands out powers left and right. What should be a smooth, orderly inheritance of roles becomes slightly chaotic, like a royal father scattering offices among sons and sons-in-law, producing future conflicts in the process. Even when texts don't spell out this is about brothers, they move in a family logic. Senior and junior, legitimate and less legitimate, heir and displaced claimant. The closest mythic expressions of that tension sometimes come tucked inside what look like political narratives. Royal inscriptions love to talk about brothers who rebel. One king will boast that he put down the uprising of his brother, or restored the proper succession after an unworthy son seized the throne. In reality, these figures may or may not have been blood relatives. The language of kinship is doing political work. It softens rivalry when useful. We're all brothers here, and sharpens it when necessary. My brother betrayed me and I crushed him. Myths mirror that ambiguity at the divine level. In the Akkadian epic of Atrahasis, the gods themselves are divided into great gods who sit at the top, and other gods who do the actual digging of canals and maintenance work. When the workers revolt, it reads almost like a palace coup led by disgruntled junior relatives tired of doing the chores. The resolution, creating humans to take over the labour, restores the hierarchy. but you can sense the anxiety. What if the younger forces in the house decide they've had enough? Elsewhere, brotherhood becomes a way to explore cooperation rather than revolt. A famous example is not from the earlier Sumerian layer, but comes into the broader Mesopotamian tradition, Gilgamesh and Enkidu. They are not brothers by blood, yet the text pushes them steadily toward that language. They become companions, friends, but also something closer to ritual siblings, paired heroes whose bond changes both of them. Gilgamesh is a king. Enkidu begins as a wild man outside the city living with animals. When they finally meet, they fight. It is a brutal, drawn-out clash, almost a mirror of two rival princes testing each other. But instead of ending with one killing the other, the story pivots. The struggle turns into recognition. They embrace. Their brotherhood is forged through conflict but stabilizes rule instead of shattering it. Underneath that arc, you can hear social questions at work. How should a city treat those on its margins? How do you bring dangerous outsiders into a royal system without breaking it? The brothers stand in for whole classes of people. Other stories handle succession more directly. Lists of kings and gods sometimes note that a younger figure seized the kingship from an older one, then immediately reassure the reader that this was in fact what the older god wanted all along. A precarious transfer of power is rewritten as harmonious family planning. The moment of rivalry is remembered, but smoothed over. And again, human politics is never far away. City-states in southern Mesopotamia were crowded together, trading, making alliances, raiding, occasionally dominating one another. When a new dynasty pushed out an old one, when a younger branch of a house claimed the throne, it could be narrated as a brother replacing brother, son correcting father, or legitimate heir finally displacing an improper ruler. Myth, in this context, becomes a pressure valve. You can't safely talk in public about every fear you might have about what the king's sons are planning, or how the neighbouring city might stab you in the back despite yesterday's treaty. But you can tell a story about gods and heroes whose brothers do exactly that. You also get texts where the family label is clearly symbolic. When Assyrian or Babylonian kings write to each other as brother, they are not pretending to share a mother. They are claiming parallel status. If one side starts calling the other son, that's an insult, a demotion. The rhetoric of brotherhood here encodes hierarchy, not biology. So when myths show a brother being denied his rightful portion, or being made to kneel, or being welcomed into a shared rule, listeners could hear more than household drama. They could hear commentary on treaties, vassalage, and the delicate question of who actually holds power. That's why it helps to distinguish two levels every time we encounter a sibling story in this world. On one level, there is the literal family narrative. Parents, children, household squabbles, favoured sons, neglected daughters. These speak to anyone who has ever lived inside a family, and ancient Mesopotamians certainly used them to process personal griefs and jealousies. On another level, there is the dynastic or symbolic storytelling. Gods as stand-ins for royal houses, brothers as neighbouring rulers, divine feasts and quarrels as mirrors of real councils and coups. Here, myth is not just about how one son feels when another gets more attention. It's about how a kingdom worries when one branch of the ruling line seems to be losing favour, or when an outsider threatens to step into the line of inheritance. Once you start hearing both layers at once, the field of interpretation widens. A god pushed out of the assembly might be a way of thinking about a dethroned king. A story about a younger divine figure being elevated over elders might comfort a new dynasty trying to justify its rise. A tale of brothers who fight and then reconcile could be an appeal for peaceful settlement between rival cities, using deities as safe proxies. And this brings us back toward Cain and Abel by a slightly different path. If Mesopotamian listeners were used to hearing brother as a flexible category, sometimes literal, sometimes political, sometimes both. Then a later story about two early brothers would not only evoke household tragedy, it could also hum with broader questions. Whose offering, whose way of life, whose claim gets recognized as legitimate? What happens to the unfavored line? Does it disappear or move outward or become a lingering threat on the margins? The biblical text itself stays close-mouthed. It gives you a family, a field, a killing. But in the wider ancient Near Eastern environment, brother against brother stories were already carrying more than private emotion. They were ways of thinking about succession, rank, and the fear that the person who stands next to you, closest in blood or closest in power, might one day become your rival. Reading Cain and Abel against that background doesn't tell us exactly what the Hebrew writer intended. It does, however, invite us to hear the story as more than the sad collapse of a single household. The first murder can also be the first fracture in a human order, between professions, between lines of descent, between those whose gifts are seen and those whose gifts are not. To see how deeply that fracture cuts, and why blood on the ground becomes such a powerful taboo, we have to follow the story into its darkest turn, from rivalry to killing, and from killing to a curse that echoes far beyond one field. If you listen closely to the Cain story, the moment of crisis is not actually the blow itself. We're not told how Cain kills Abel. No weapon is named. The text gives you almost nothing to picture. What it lingers on instead is what happens after. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. That image, a life spilled into the soil, and the soil itself becoming a kind of witness, is not unique to Genesis. It fits into a much older way of thinking, very much at home in Mesopotamia. There, killing could be many things at once. On the one hand, it could be legitimate, a king executing rebels, soldiers in battle, even ritual slaughter of animals. These were not treated as murder in the same way a secret ambush in a field would be. On the other hand, any taking of life carried a kind of danger, a stain, a potential for retribution. The world was imagined as dense with personal connections, between the living and the dead, between humans and gods, between families and their ancestors. To break that web violently was not a neutral act. It sent ripples. Some law collections spell this out in terms modern readers might recognize as pollution. If someone kills another person unlawfully, they don't just owe a fine. They have disturbed the social and cosmic order. The dead person's kin have a recognized right to vengeance. The city authorities have an interest in making sure that vengeance does not spiral out of control. The gods have their own angle. Bloodshed unchecked can make a land unclean, unfit for blessing. Not every text uses that exact vocabulary, but the pattern recurs. The act of killing creates an imbalance. Think of a household in a Mesopotamian city. It's not just a nuclear family. It is servants, dependents, apprentices, sometimes distant kin. It has its own gods, its own dead to whom offerings are made, its own store of honour and shame. Now imagine that someone removes one of its members in a sudden unlawful act. You have not only deprived the household of labour and future children, you have broken a series of expectations. Who will care for the parents in old age? Who will inherit property? Who will maintain the family's little shrine? You may also have humiliated the house if the killing was public or cowardly or seen as an insult. The social damage is hard to repair. Feuds can begin here, stretching across generations. Mesopotamian law and ritual step into that gap and try to manage it. Some laws insist on blood for blood. If a free man kills a free man, he shall be killed. Others allow for money in place of blood, especially when the victim is of lower status. A payment of silver or land or goods stands in as a kind of compensation to the wounded household. but that payment is never presented as just a financial transaction. It is a way of restoring balance, acknowledging the loss and giving the family something they can use to rebuild. Alongside this, you find procedures that look more like what later ages will call purification. Incantations and rituals mention blood guilt. A person who has shed blood may be tormented by an evil word or an evil omen hanging over them. The spirit of the dead might rest uneasy, causing illness or misfortune. Priests and exorcists offer ceremonies, offerings made at crossroads, libations poured into the earth, prayers that the anger of the dead and of the gods be turned aside. The language here often mixes external and internal worlds. On one level, there is clearly concern about outward consequences. The avenger of blood, that is, the closest male relative of the victim, might be coming. The authorities might step in. The murderer's property might be seized. The name might be erased from records. On another level, texts also hinted inner states, fear, sleeplessness, visions, a mind troubled or darkened. A person burdened by killing can be described as haunted, unable to prosper, blocked from normal life until something is done. The closest thing to our word guilt in Akkadian tends to be expressed as sin or offence, something you have placed upon yourself. It is not purely psychological. It has weight. It can be transferred, lessened, or, in some rituals, symbolically removed onto an animal or an object. Yet the prayers also suggest that the person feels it, not just as legal liability, but as disquiet. All of this gives a context for hearing Cain's dread. When he says that his punishment is greater than he can bear, that whoever finds him will kill him, the fear belongs in a world where the avenger of blood is expected to act, and where land stained with unsatisfied murder cries out for correction. Mesopotamian documents detail several responses to that problem. A killer might flee to a temple or a city and seek asylum under a god's protection. An oath might be sworn between families to end a cycle of revenge. A king might issue an edict cancelling certain debts and protections, including, in some rare cases, commuting penalties for killing. In myth, gods themselves sometimes step in to shield a marked individual whose survival serves a larger purpose. Ritual texts show another layer, the idea that killing can stick to a person even if human courts are satisfied. A soldier returning from war, for example, might undergo a washing ceremony. The god is asked to remove the killing from his hands, from his body, from his shadow. When an executioner performs a legal killing, there may be offerings afterward to keep that killing from clinging to him or to the king who ordered it. It is not that societies regarded all killing as morally equal. They drew sharp lines between justified and unjustified, lawful and unlawful, but the underlying sense that bloodshed is inherently dangerous, that it opens doors you then have to work hard to close, is remarkably consistent. This is where the image of blood in the ground becomes potent. In Mesopotamian laments, the land itself can mourn. Cities destroyed in war are pictured as crying out. The earth is not inert. It can register injustice. The dead, if not properly buried or honoured, can wander, thirsty and resentful. A slain person whose case is unresolved is especially troubling. Genesis compresses all those layers into one line. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. The writer doesn't need to spell out a whole legal code. For listeners in an ancient Near Eastern setting, the combination of blood, ground, and divine hearing would already carry the weight of pollution, vengeance, and the need for some form of expiation. Cain's fear that whoever finds me will kill me also resonates with the expectation that a murderer is fair game outside the protections of his house and city. At the same time, the story will take a surprising turn. Instead of endorsing that automatic vengeance, the deity will set a mark and a threat to protect the killer. In Mesopotamian practice, that mix of punishment, protection, and ritual management is familiar. A killer might be banished yet spared, cursed yet shielded by an oath, stained yet ritually cleansed enough to go on living somewhere else. The biblical narrative is not copying any known Mesopotamian law code. It is not reenacting a particular ritual we can point to on a tablet, but it moves through a world of ideas where murder is more than a private act of anger. It is a breach that sends shockwaves through family, city, land, and the unseen realm. To follow those shockwaves, and to see why the answer to them in many traditions is exile rather than immediate annihilation, we need to walk with Cain as he leaves the field behind and steps into a new, precarious existence on the margins. When Cain steps east of Eden, the text is doing more than pointing on a map. In the world that produced Genesis, to be sent away was not just to walk in a different direction, it was to fall out of a net. Mesopotamian cities were not simply clusters of houses and walls, they were dense webs of obligation. Your protection came from being known, by a household, by a lineage, by a neighborhood, by a temple. Your name appeared in contracts. Your relatives could speak for you. Your God had an address. To be exiled was to be peeled out of that system. A person driven from their city lost more than a roof. They lost access to courts, to shared storage, to irrigation canals and grain rations. If you were not attached to a house, you had no obvious claim on food in a bad year, no one automatically responsible for your burial, no family altar where your name would be remembered. In some legal texts, exile is explicitly one of the gravest penalties. It is paired with confiscation of property and the loss of one's place in the city. You're not killed, but you are removed from the structures that make life predictable. From the perspective of people living behind city walls, outside space had a particular flavour. On one side, the cultivated fields. These were extensions of the city itself, measured, irrigated, regulated by boundary stones and contracts. Beyond that, the land began to blur, marsh, desert edge, and steppe. The steppe was a real geography, a band of semi-arid land stretching along the river valleys, supporting flocks, scattered wells, and people who moved seasonally. But for city dwellers, it easily doubled as a mental category, the outside where danger originated and where those who could not fit inside might drift. Texts sometimes speak of the man of the steppe, almost as a type. He might be a herder, a bandit, a mercenary. He lives by different rules. He comes to the city as trader or raider. He can be hired, feared, or admired. But he is not ours in the same way as the farmer with his plot on the irrigation canal. This is the kind of space Cain is imagined as moving into. Not empty wilderness in our modern romantic sense, but the zone beyond firm boundaries, beyond obvious oversight, beyond immediate kin. Ancient scribes knew that people did not simply vanish when expelled. So how did outcasts go on existing? There are hints scattered through letters and contracts. One path was work. A person in disgrace at home might attach themselves as a labourer or servant in another household, sometimes in another town. Status could be drastically reduced, but survival might still be possible if some patron took you on. Another path was joining a different community altogether. Tribal and semi-nomadic groups on the steppe appear in records as recipients of runaway slaves, criminals, and political refugees. From the city's point of view, such people had gone over to outsiders. From the inside of those groups, they might become in-laws, allies, sometimes even leaders if they brought skills or connections. We also find people seeking protection under a god's name. A temple could, in some cases, serve as a new anchoring point. You become a servant of a deity, bound to that sanctuary, folded into its staff and dependents. You're still marginal compared to a full citizen with land, but you're not simply floating in danger. Cain's fear, whoever finds me will kill me, fits a world where, stripped of your protective network, you are exposed to retaliation, robbery, or enslavement wherever you go. His continued life depends on acquiring some new kind of shield. That is where the story's next surprise will come in, with the mark and the divine warning. But before we get there, Genesis slips in a detail that has puzzled interpreters for a very long time. Cain, we are told, builds a city. On the surface, that sounds contradictory. The wanderer becomes a city founder. The restless life at the edges crystallizes into walls, gates, and a named place. In the Mesopotamian imagination, founding a city was a loaded act. There were formal rituals for it, marking out boundaries, digging first foundations, inviting the god to take up residence. Kings claimed to found, refound, or enlarge cities as a way of asserting legitimacy. To say, "I built this place," was to say, "I established order here. I made a centre where there was margin." Some scholars suspect that the biblical mention of Cain's city may echo that kind of memory. It could preserve a dim association between an old lineage, stigmatized, dangerous, remembered as of Cain, and some very early urban site. The story then does two things at once. It keeps Cain as a figure of exile and curse, and it quietly grants him a role as culture bringer, city maker. We cannot point to a specific Sumerian tablet that says, Cain was this king in such and such a town. The line of connection, if there is one, is more atmospheric than direct. But we can notice how often in Mesopotamian texts, questionable or liminal figures appear at turning points in urban history. Sometimes it is a ruler who seizes power after a catastrophe and rebuilds. Sometimes it is a group labelled as foreigners who settle on the edge of a city and are later woven into its story. Founding and refounding often happen at fault lines. After flood, after war, after expulsion, when Genesis puts a branded wanderer at the head of a city, it may be tapping into that pattern. The idea that what is solid and central now was born from someone who once lived precariously, under a cloud. It also dovetails with broader Mesopotamian anxieties about boundaries. Kings swear oaths not to move boundary stones. Curse formulas threaten anyone who shifts a marker between fields with blindness, infertility, or divine wrath. Letters complain about shepherds letting flocks stray across invisible lines. Mythic creatures are stationed at city gates, on thresholds, at crossroads, the liminal points where inside meets outside. Order, in this world, is partly about keeping categories from bleeding into each other. Field versus waste, citizen versus stranger, protected versus exposed. The Genesis portrait of Cain as a perpetual wanderer, unable to settle, sits in tension with that whole project. He is a person who makes boundaries nervous. He's neither fully inside nor fully outside, marked by God yet under judgment, city founder yet archetypal drifter. If we read that wandering motif alongside Mesopotamian worries about edges, it acquires extra depth. Cain becomes a figure who inhabits the crack between worlds, not annihilated but displaced, not embraced, but not fully expelled from divine attention either. His descendants, in the brief genealogy that follows, are linked to music, metalwork, tent-dwelling, skills and ways of life that in Mesopotamian eyes could belong to people moving through the in-between zones, bringing techniques into cities from outside or carrying city crafts into the steppe. For an ancient audience used to thinking with these gradients, city, field, steppe, house, threshold, street, us, allies, strangers, the story would not just be about a single murderer getting what he deserves. It would be about what happens when someone falls out of the net and has to live on the seam between safety and threat. It would also touch quietly on a shared worry that the margins are not empty. They are populated with people who have histories, grudges, and gifts, and those people sometimes circle back to become builders of the very worlds that once pushed them out. With all of that in mind, the next move in the narrative, God placing a mark on Cain and setting limits to vengeance, begins to look less like an odd detail and more like an intervention in those boundary anxieties themselves. The text moves quickly. Cain cries out that anyone who meets him might kill him, and immediately we hear that the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. Behind that short line lies a tangle of questions. What kind of act is this? On one reading it looks like mercy. Cain has done the worst thing one can do to a close kin member, but instead of simply being left to his fate, he receives a form of protection. God does not retract the sentence of exile, but he also does not hand Cain over to the first avenger who happens to cross his path. On another reading, it looks like control. In many traditional societies, the family of a murdered person has the right, or even the duty, to take blood revenge. Killers and their kin can become targets in turn. Vengeance may not be random, but it can echo through generations. If Cain's imagined world works anything like that, then his fear makes sense. Abel's side of the family, broader than just parents and siblings, might feel bound to even the score. A brother killed, a killer exiled, the ledger still unbalanced. The mark then functions like a divine decree pinned to Cain's body. This cycle stops here. Its purpose would not be to erase guilt, but to set a limit around what is allowed in response. The story shifts attention from the crime itself to the management of consequences. The question is no longer only, what did Cain do, but also, what will be done to Cain? Ancient Mesopotamian sources are full of worries about that second question. When violence occurs, who gets to answer it? We can see this in law collections. Many early laws do permit retaliation. Eye-for-eye style formulas are not unique to the Hebrew Bible, but they also specify procedures, thresholds, compensations. They tell you who may carry out the penalty and under what circumstances. The point is not simply to give hurt families free rein. The point is to channel anger into controlled, socially recognized forms. Other texts speak in the voice of kings or gods who boast of establishing justice in the land. Part of that ideal is that strong people cannot simply kill or maim weak people without consequence. Another part is that private feuds do not tear the community apart. In this climate, the idea of a higher authority stepping in to regulate retaliation would feel familiar. Mesopotamian people also surrounded themselves, and their vulnerable points, with protective measures that blur the line between symbol and law. On the magical side, there are amulets and incantations, clay figurines buried under thresholds, inscribed with the names of demons to be repelled, necklaces and seals bearing images of protective deities, rituals for binding a curse or turning back an evil spell. On the institutional side, there are boundary stones and inscriptions. A carved stone might be raised on the edge of a field with a long text on it. It records who owns the land, how it was granted, which gods are called to guard the line. Anyone who moves that stone, the inscription warns, will incur specific divine punishments. The stone is both a physical object and a carrier of a decree. The mark on Cain can be heard with both of these backgrounds in mind. Is it a kind of amulet, a sign that he is under a deity's peculiar protection? Or is it like a boundary stone in reverse, not marking land as inviolable, but marking a person as off-limits to certain kinds of violence? The Hebrew word used in Genesis is not very specific. It can mean a sign, a token, an omen, a reminder, a signal. Elsewhere in the Bible, signs can be public marvels, ritual actions, or even agreements codified in practice. A rainbow in the sky, blood on a doorframe, a pattern of rest every seventh day. Nothing in the word itself forces us to picture a tattoo on Cain's forehead. It might be something visible on his body. It might also be a recognized status, a story told about him, a standing proclamation. This man, though guilty, is under God's restraint. Touch him and you are challenging God. We have analogues for this kind of ambiguous protection. In some Mesopotamian treaties, a person or group can be placed under the oath of a god. To harm them is to break that oath, inviting divine wrath. We also see language about taking refuge at a sanctuary. A runaway, a debtor, or even a criminal might clasp the statue of a god or the rope of a temple and thereby trigger special rules about how they can be treated. They're not necessarily absolved, but they're no longer in a purely private space of vengeance. In later Greek and Roman worlds, we hear about asylum and sacred zones around temples. The specific institutions differ, but the pattern is familiar. A mark, spatial, ritual, or narrative, changes what may be done to someone. Cain's mark, then, can be imagined as occupying several layers at once. There's a divine layer. God declares that anyone who kills Cain will be avenged sevenfold. That is the decree itself, the law behind the sign. There is a social layer. People who share this story are supposed to know that God has said this. If the story is believed, the mark is effective because it is widely recognized. It creates a social cost for anyone who considers ignoring it. And there may or may not be a physical layer, some token on Cain's person that cues the story, like an amulet cues the incantation, or a seal impression cues the contract behind it. We cannot reach back and see what ancient Israelites first pictured here. Later interpreters imagined everything from a skin disease to a hairstyle to an aura of fear. None of those are in the text. The Bible itself stays deliberately vague. What it is very clear about is the function. The mark does not erase Cain's crime. It does not restore him to Eden or lift his sentence of restless life. It prevents the next act of blood from being taken in Abel's name. That is a striking move in a world where family honor and blood obligation could easily dominate reactions. It places a break where we might expect escalation. From a broader Mesopotamian perspective, this fits into a long conversation about how far vengeance should go. Legal texts sometimes try to cap retaliation at the original injury. If you knock out a man's tooth, your tooth may be taken, but not your life. Other times, compensation is substituted for direct harm. Silver pays for an eye, an ox pays for a killed animal. Mythic and wisdom texts go further, warning that violence can spiral. A single offence can lead to feuds that swallow whole houses. Gods and kings are praised, not only for punishing, but for ending the quarrel and quenching strife. The Genesis story's God, in placing a mark on Cain, acts in that peacemaking mode. He pronounces judgment on the murderer, but he also refuses to hand the story entirely over to human patterns of payback. The threat of sevenfold vengeance now lies, not in Abel's relatives charging out with weapons, but in the hands of the same deity who has already chosen to spare Cain's life. We could see this as sheer grace, a scandalous pity for a killer. We could see it as a claim to monopoly over life and death. God, not humans, will decide when Cain's line comes to an end. We could even see it as a warning sign, almost like a curse written on a person. Here is what happens when you lift your hand against your brother. The text itself leaves these options side by side. It shows us a branded wanderer who is both judged and protected, feared and untouchable, living out his days and founding a line. It offers no detailed ritual, no legal manual, no description of what the mark looks like. For readers attuned to Mesopotamian patterns, though, it invites comparison. Divine signs, protective inscriptions, legal limits on retaliation, all of these would have been part of the imaginative furniture in the cultures that frame this story. Cain's mark, in that sense, belongs to a family of ideas. That a higher power can step between injury and revenge, can rename someone's status, can plant a sign that says, "Thus far and no father. How tightly that idea is tied to any specific ritual or law code is something we can't reconstruct with certainty. What we can see is the shape, a God who refuses to let violence be the only answer to violence, and a human being who lives under that refusal like a seal pressed into his very being. In the next movement of the narrative, that shape will be tested. Cain's descendants will take the language of vengeance and stretch it in new directions, and the fragile boundary between justice and escalation will come under pressure again. If we want to imagine how a story like Cain and Abel could emerge in a world shaped by Mesopotamian ideas, we have to follow it into a very particular kind of building. Not a temple, not a palace, a school. In Mesopotamia, literacy was a specialized craft. Most people never learned to read or write. Clay tablets and styluses belonged to a narrow group, the Scribes. To become one of them, you didn't just pick up a reed and start scratching. You entered a scribal house, sometimes called the tablet house, and you copied, over and over again. Your first tablets were simple, lines of signs, syllables, word lists. Then lists of professions, animals, plants, cities. The world broken down into ordered columns. You drilled until your hand and your memory moved together. Once you had the basics, the curriculum changed. You began copying what the tradition considered its classics. Hymns to gods and temples, laments over fallen cities, royal inscriptions, legal prologues, mythic narratives. The goal was not originality, it was mastery. A student would take a model tablet written by a teacher, prop it up, and reproduce its lines on a fresh piece of clay. The same phrases, the same openings and closings, the same stock metaphors. Mistakes were corrected, deviations smoothed away. But in that long labour, something subtle happened. Formulas were preserved, but they were also stretched. A clever student might slightly vary a line to fit a new context. A teacher might combine motifs from two older hymns into a new prayer suited for a different city's god. A royal inscription for one king might be revised for his successor, keeping the basic skeleton but adjusting the details. Scribal education, in other words, was both a copying machine and a quiet engine of adaptation. This is one reason Sumerian literature had such a long afterlife. Sumerian, the language of the earlier cities like Uruk and Ur, eventually stopped being spoken on the street. Everyday conversation shifted to Akkadian, a Semitic language closer to what would later be Aramaic and Hebrew. But Sumerian texts did not vanish with the spoken language. They were pulled into the school. For centuries after Sumerian died out in daily life, scribes continued to learn it as a kind of scholarly tongue, much like medieval monks learning Latin long after villagers spoke French or Italian. Akkadian, meanwhile, became the Great Bridge. It was written in the same cuneiform script, shared many formulas, and borrowed freely from Sumerian vocabulary. Akkadian myths retold Sumerian plots. Akkadian prayers echoed Sumerian hymns. Law collections in Akkadian reused Sumerian legal language, and Akkadian itself spread far beyond Sumer's original heartland. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Akkadian was a prestige language of administration and diplomacy across much of the Near East. Letters between far-off courts, Egyptian pharaohs, Hittite kings, city rulers in Canaan were written in Akkadian on clay tablets in cuneiform. We can still read some of them, the Amarna letters, for instance, found in Egypt, but written mostly in Akkadian script, sent from cities in Syria and Canaan. This means that scribal formulas, story motifs, and theological phrases could travel with surprising ease, even when people weren't sharing a mother tongue. A scribe in a Levantine city might grow up speaking a local West Semitic dialect, but learn to write in Akkadian, memorize Sumerian sayings, and correspond with Egypt. His mental library would be layered: hometown proverbs, schoolroom Sumerian lines, Akkadian epithets of gods. Stories do not move on their own, they ride along these layered networks. Trade routes carried goods, but they also carried people who told tales at night. Merchants haggling in caravanserai, sailors exchanging news in harbours, diplomatic missions required interpreters and scribes, who brought their tablets and their habits with them. When a foreign king needed a treaty, he called someone trained in formulas that might go back centuries. The specific names changed, the pattern remained. Migration and war shifted whole populations. Deportees taken by an empire brought their own songs and stories to new lands. Conquerors imposed their gods, but they also absorbed local traditions, sometimes without quite realizing it. In that world, exact copying was only one path of transmission. The other was oral. Before a story was ever written on clay, it existed in voices. A priest chanting a liturgy, a storyteller performing at a feast, a parent warning a child with an old example. Oral tradition is fluid by design. Repetition fixes certain anchor points, character types, basic plots, striking images, but the details flex to meet each audience. A shepherd's version of a tale will emphasize different things than a city official's. A story told in a time of famine will lean toward different morals than one told in a time of peace. When a scribe first writes down such a story, he is fixing one moment in a long stream, not the stream itself. Later, other scribes might read that fixed version back into performance, and then those new performances might be written again with further adjustments. Written and oral circulation intertwine, braid, feed each other. This is important when we ask how a biblical story relates to older Mesopotamian material. It is tempting to imagine a single line, a Sumerian tablet on a shelf, a Hebrew author reading it, then composing Genesis 4 as a direct answer. Sometimes we have evidence for something close to that, especially with large-scale parallels like flood stories and royal inscriptions. But often the relationship is messier. Influence can be diffuse. Think instead of a shared cultural pool slowly filling up. For millennia, across Mesopotamia and its neighbours, people told stories about favoured and unfavoured offerings, about rival brothers, about shepherds and farmers, about gods choosing one person and rejecting another. Some of those stories were written in Sumerian and copied in scribal schools as classics. Others lived mostly in oral circulation, tweaked and recast from town to town. Some motifs, like divine preference for certain sacrifices, or the danger of jealousy when one brother prospers, became almost background assumptions, themes in the air, when Israelite storytellers centuries later shaped the narrative of Cain and Abel. They were not starting from a blank slate. They inhabited a world whose imaginative furniture had been built, in part, by those older Mesopotamian traditions. But that does not mean we can point to one tablet and say, here is Cain, here is Abel. Instead, we see patterns, the way offerings can become tests of favour, the way sibling rivalry can stand in for wider tensions between ways of life, the way a god's choice can provoke resentment and lead to violence. These are the kinds of motifs that can spread without leaving a neat paper trail. A hymn hints at them, a wisdom saying alludes to them, a myth dramatizes them. Centuries later, they surface in a new configuration, in a different language, with different names. Scribal schools kept certain formulaic expressions and story frames alive long after their original settings had vanished. Akkadian served as a bridge, carrying Sumerian-born ideas into the wider Near Eastern conversation. Trade and diplomacy moved those ideas from court to court, port to port. Oral storytelling reshaped them in every generation. By the time we reach the world in which Genesis is told, the stream has branched many times. The question is less, did someone copy this line from that tablet? And more, How did a long, tangled history of teaching, reciting, writing, and remembering make certain story shapes available? In the next step, we'll trace those shapes more directly, following them from the Mesopotamian tablet rooms into the literary world that eventually gave us the Hebrew Bible. When we talk about from Mesopotamia to the Hebrew Bible, we're really stretching a thread across a very long span of time. On one end, we have Bronze Age Mesopotamia, cities like Ur, Nippur, Mari, and later Babylon, where Sumerian and Akkadian texts were being copied on clay, recited in temples, and drilled into young scribes. On the other end, we have the world in which the stories of Genesis were being shaped, edited, and collected, mostly on parchment and leather, in a West Semitic language, under very different political and theological pressures. The line between those worlds is not straight, but we can sketch it in broad strokes. Most of the Sumerian material that interests us, the myths, hymns, wisdom texts, and disputations about shepherds and farmers, belongs broadly to the 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE. Old Babylonian scribes in the early 2nd millennium are already preserving and reworking Sumerian pieces from earlier centuries, turning them into classics of their school curriculum. By the later 2nd millennium, cuneiform culture is still alive, but the political landscape is shifting. Great kingdoms rise and fall. Kassites rule Babylon. Assyria expands and contracts. New groups appear in the western lands, among them the people who will later be called Israelites. Meanwhile, Sumerian as a spoken language is long gone. Akkadian dominates written culture in Mesopotamia. In the western Levant, local dialects of West Semitic are spoken in towns and hill villages, languages ancestral to Phoenician, Aramaic, and Hebrew. And somewhere in this long story, the Hebrew Bible begins to take shape. The texts we now know as Genesis, Exodus, and the rest of the Torah were probably assembled and edited across several centuries, with traditions going back to the late 2nd millennium and major phases of compilation and redaction in the 1st millennium BCE, especially during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. So between the first flourishing of Sumerian literature and the final shape of Genesis, we're looking at more than 1,000 years, sometimes closer to 2. That's a span in which empires rise, scripts change, languages shift, gods are redefined, and whole populations move. To understand how story motifs might travel across that gap, we have to look not just at texts, but at contact zones, the Levant, the strip of land from the Syrian coast down through Canaan to the edge of Sinai, was one of those zones. From very early on, this region sat between bigger powers, to the west, Egypt, to the north and east, the great Mesopotamian kingdoms. Later, to the northwest, Anatolian and Aegean powers. Caravans ran up and down these corridors, ships moved along the coast, armies passed through, and with them came scribes, merchants, and deportees. In the 14th century BCE, when the Amarna letters were written, the rulers of Canaanite city-states were corresponding with the Egyptian pharaoh in Akkadian. Their scribes knew cuneiform. They used Mesopotamian formulas. They invoked gods whose names and titles show clear Babylonian influence, alongside older local deities. Further north, cities like Ugarit used their own alphabetic script but drew heavily on Mesopotamian mythic patterns. Their pantheon, their divine council scenes, their storm god epithets all resonate with themes we see in Akkadian and earlier Sumerian material. Later still, when Assyria and Babylon extended their power westward, they brought more than armies. They installed governors, demanded tribute, set up imperial cults, and deported conquered populations. One of those deportee groups, in the 6th century BCE, was the Judean elite taken to Babylon. Now imagine what that means for stories. People raised on local Judean traditions Tales of ancestors, law codes, hymns to YHWH find themselves living in a city where ancient epics, hymns, and disputations are still being copied in temple schools, where public rituals reenact myths of creation and kingship that go back to Sumerian prototypes, where the very landscape is saturated with names like Enlil, Marduk, Ishtar. Even if an ordinary Judean refugee never learned to read cuneiform, the environment itself carried echoes. Processions, festivals, street stories repeating older mythic frames in new forms. And some Judeans almost certainly did become familiar with the scholarly culture. Diaspora communities often produced bilingual intermediaries, people who learned the conqueror's language, worked in administration, or interacted with their scribal institutions. This is one way motifs move. Not through one clean act of copying, but through slow immersion in a world where older traditions are still active. When we talk about borrowing, scholars rarely mean a simple mechanical act like plagiarizing a paragraph. Borrowing, in this context, is more like taking building blocks and rearranging them to construct a new house. An older text might present a dispute between a shepherd and a farmer over whose offering pleases a god. Centuries later, a new story might pick up that basic pattern. Two figures, different livelihoods, differential divine favour, but plug in different gods, different morals, and a different sense of what the conflict means. Sometimes the resemblance is tight. Similar plot sequence, similar verbal formulas. That's where many scholars see direct literary dependence, or at least use of a common written vorlage. Other times, the resemblance is looser. Shared character types, familiar tensions, common symbolic associations. That's the realm of diffuse influence and shared cultural background. The Hebrew Bible's authors and editors were not neutral collectors of tales. They were theologians, even when they didn't call themselves that. Their storytelling choices were shaped by a strong monotheising tendency, the drive to interpret the world as governed by a single, unique deity. That tendency transforms borrowed motifs in profound ways. In Mesopotamian stories, you might see multiple gods favouring different brothers, or one god taking sides in a quarrel that reflects competition within the divine assembly. Choices can be arbitrary, or based on the character of each god. In Genesis, divine choice is concentrated. YHWH is not one god among many. He is the only true God. When he prefers one offering over another, that choice becomes an expression of a single, overarching will, not the politics of a divine council, but the action of the one creator. This has narrative consequences. In Mesopotamian texts, the focus might fall on how to manage divine rivalries, or how to secure patronage from the right deity. In Genesis, the focus shifts to human response to one god's decision, trust or resentment, repentance or violence. Older narrative building blocks, brothers in conflict, differential divine favour, exile, protective marks, get pulled into a framework where all of reality, moral and cosmic funnels back to one source. Monotheizing also compresses the divine-human distance. In some Mesopotamian disputes, gods act through omens, intermediaries or dreams. In the Cain and Abel story, the Lord speaks directly, warns directly, confronts directly. The same building blocks, envy, warning, sin crouching at the door, now serve a theology in which the human heart is laid bare before a single, omniscient presence. Because of these deep shifts, scholars do not all agree on how to map the route from Mesopotamia to the Hebrew Bible. On one side, some argue for strong, sometimes quite specific dependence, that certain biblical passages are reworking identifiable Mesopotamian compositions. For flood narratives, creation motifs, or royal ideologies, there is substantial evidence for that. When it comes to shorter tales like Cain and Abel, others are more cautious. The basic elements, two brothers, rival offerings, jealousy, murder could, in principle, arise independently in different cultures. Human life produces siblings, inequality, and violence in many times and places. This gives us two broad models. In a direct dependence model, an Israelite or Judean writer had access, directly or indirectly, to a Mesopotamian text or performance that shaped the Cain and Abel narrative. The Dumuzi and Enkimdu type disputes, the farmer-shepherd tension, the offerings and divine preference motif all feed in. In a parallel development model, similar social realities, competition between herders and farmers, anxieties about divine favour, the trauma of intra-family violence, lead to similar story patterns without a single literary pipeline connecting them. Most careful work today inhabits the space between these extremes. It recognises that Israel did not grow in isolation. It lived in a region long saturated with Mesopotamian ideas, transmitted through languages, scripts, trade and empire. At the same time, it treats each biblical story as a distinct composition, shaped by its own theological aims, not just a thinly disguised copy of something older. So when we ask how a Mesopotamian shepherd-farmer dispute relates to Cain and Abel, the answer is usually layered. There may be a family resemblance because of shared ancestry in an older cultural pool. There may be deliberate engagement, especially if exilic or post-exilic authors were reflecting on Mesopotamian traditions around them. And there may be genuinely local developments, where common human experiences push stories into similar shapes. What we can say, with some confidence, is that by the time the Cain and Abel story took its current form, the ancient Near Eastern world had already spent many centuries thinking about the very themes it treats: offerings and favour, brothers and rivalry, murder and exile, divine judgment and strange mercy. In the next step, we'll narrow the focus even more, looking closely at what those Sumerian and Akkadian tablets actually say, and where the trail of parallels stops, leaving the distinct voice of Genesis standing on its own. If you spend any time roaming around the internet's stranger history corners, you'll eventually bump into a very confident claim that archaeologists have dug up a Sumerian Cain and Abel tablet, which proves the Bible simply copied an older story. That sounds dramatic. It's also not what the tablets actually give us. There is no single Sumerian or Akkadian text that tells the story of two named brothers, one a farmer and one a shepherd, who bring offerings to a god, experience unequal favour, and end with the first human murder and a divine mark of protection. What we have instead is a cluster of texts that circle some of the same themes from different angles. The closest, as we have already seen, is the composition often titled Dumuzi and Enkimdu. In that piece, preserved on Old Babylonian tablets but drawing on older Sumerian tradition, we meet two rival suitors for the goddess Inanna. Enkimdu is the farmer, the man of the canal and the plough, the one who promises grain in the storehouses, beer in the vats, stable supplies and orderly abundance. Dumuzi is the shepherd, the man of the flock and the pasture, the one who offers lambs and milk and the shifting wealth of mobile herds. The two argue over who is more suitable for Inanna, piling up boasts about their respective livelihoods. The farmer emphasizes security, irrigation, the steady yield of fields. The shepherd emphasizes luxury, prestige, the fat of the land. Inanna in the end chooses Dumuzi, and the text closes not with bloodshed but with reconciliation. Enkimdu yields, promising cooperation rather than revenge. So here we do see a farmer and a shepherd contrasted. We do see a choice that privileges one lifeway over another. We do see the language of offerings, abundance, and favour. But we don't see brothers. We don't see murder. We don't see exile or a divine mark. Other Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts add pieces to the pattern without ever assembling a Cain and Abel duplicate. There are disputation texts where paired figures argue about their value. summer and winter, bird and fish, copper and silver. Sometimes a god judges between them. Sometimes the debate circles around who benefits the temple more, whose offerings are more pleasing. There are hymns and rituals that associate shepherding with kingship and proximity to the gods. There are laments and wisdom texts that wrestle with undeserved suffering, with the apparent arbitrariness of divine favour. There are myths of violence within families, struggles between siblings or near siblings among the gods, leading to exile or curse. If you lay all of this out on a table, you can start to see why some people jump to the idea of a Sumerian Cain and Abel. The farmer-shepherd tension is there, rivalry is there, divine preference is there, family conflict and violence are there, though often in divine instead of human form. But when historians and Assyriologists sit down with the actual tablets, they notice just as quickly what is missing. No Sumerian text we possess tells the first murder of a human being as a compact, focused narrative. There are no Mesopotamian tablets about two human brothers named anything like Cain and Abel, standing side by side at an altar, one accepted, one rejected, one killing the other in a field. There is no Sumerian narrative where a god confronts the murderer, banishes him to wander, then places a protective sign on him so that others will not take vengeance. Those elements, the first murder framed as a moral watershed, the tight psychological focus on jealousy, warning and failure, the combination of curse and mercy, belong to the particular shape of Genesis as we have it. This is why careful scholarship tends to use more cautious language. Instead of saying, Cain and Abel comes straight from a Sumerian tablet, historians talk about shared motifs, structural parallels, or functional similarities between traditions. When they weigh possible connections, they usually ask a series of questions. Are the motifs the same, or just similar? A farmer and a shepherd can appear in any agrarian society, but when they are set in explicit rivalry over divine favour, that's a more specific configuration. When they stand in a larger pattern of shepherd-farmer debates across the region, the resemblance tightens. Do the stories serve a similar function? In Dumuzi and Enkimdu, the dispute helps articulate the relationship between agriculture, pastoralism, and divine blessing in a world where temples rely on both. In Genesis, the story probes questions of moral responsibility, sin, and the nature of divine justice within a monotheistic frame. Related tensions, different end goals. What is the larger context? A Sumerian disputation lives in a polytheistic environment, embedded in cult practice, temple economy, and court performance. A biblical ancestor tale lives in a narrative arc about creation, covenant, and the origins of Israel. Even when the building blocks line up, the architecture is not the same. And then there is dating. The Sumerian and early Akkadian pieces about shepherds, farmers, offerings, and rivalries are centuries, sometimes more than a millennium, older than the likely formation of the final Cain and Abel narrative. That time gap makes direct word-for-word dependence unlikely, but it does allow for long-term transmission of patterns, especially across a region constantly cross-pollinated by trade, empire, and scribal education. So when specialists evaluate a supposed link, they are wary of two opposite mistakes. On one side is the temptation to see a one-to-one pipeline everywhere, to assume that every biblical story must have a neat Sumerian original hiding behind it, if only we dig up the right tablet. On the other side is the temptation to declare everything entirely independent, to act as if the people who produced Genesis somehow lived in a vacuum, untouched by centuries of Mesopotamian thought all around them. Instead, most work proceeds in the messy middle. It recognizes that certain clusters of Mesopotamian texts, like Dumuzi and Enkimdu, the shepherd-farmer disputations and other rivalry scenes, form the best textual touchpoints for thinking about Cain and Abel. They give us a feel for how ancient Near Eastern cultures dramatize conflicts over work, offerings, and divine favour. At the same time, it acknowledges that the Genesis author has done something distinct with those themes, collapsing polytheistic competition into a single god's choice, turning a courtly rivalry into a primal act of intrafamily violence, framing the episode as a moment in a larger fallen exile storyline that runs from Eden through the flood and onward. What, then, is the measured takeaway? Not that a scribe in Jerusalem or Babylon sat with a specific Sumerian tablet and copied out Cain and Abel with the names changed. Not that Genesis is merely a translation of Dumuzi and Enkimdu from one language into another. Rather that by the time Cain and Abel was told in the form we know, the ancient Near Eastern imagination was already saturated with stories about farmers and shepherds, about competing offerings, about divine preference and human envy, about violence that tears apart what should be the closest of bonds. The Sumerian tablets do not give us a secret original Cain and Abel. They do something subtler and in some ways more interesting. They let us hear older voices working on the same questions from a different angle. They show us that long before the Bible, people in this part of the world were using story to think about work and worth, about why some are favoured and others are not, about what happens when rivalry outruns restraint. They shine a light on the shared hallway in which Genesis is one of the later doors, not a photocopy of an earlier plaque. And when we set the tablets next to the biblical text, not to declare a winner, but to listen, we begin to sense both the deep continuity of human concern and the sharp, distinctive contour of the Cain and Abel story as it stands. From there, the path leads into darker territory, blood on the ground, the weight of taboo, and the way one killing can echo through an entire imagined human family. That's where we'll go next. So, where does that leave us? Here at the edge of the story, with the clay tablets quiet on one side and the Hebrew text on the other, it leaves us mostly with probabilities and patterns rather than proofs. The safest thing we can say is that Cain and Abel lives in the same imaginative neighbourhood as those older Mesopotamian pieces. It breathes the same air, farmers and shepherds, altars and offerings, divine choices that seem to cut through human lives like a knife. The Hebrew story takes those shared concerns and arranges them into its own tightly drawn drama. Is it possible that some faint memory of a particular Sumerian tale lay somewhere in the background? A story told and retold, copied and recast, drifting down the centuries until a later author shaped it into something new. Yes, that's possible. Is there any tablet we can point to and say, with confidence, here is Cain and Abel before it put on its biblical clothes? No, the evidence simply doesn't carry us that far, so we end, not with a dramatic reveal, but with a kind of careful balance. On one side, real thematic ancestry. Older stories about work and worth, about rival offerings, about divine favour and human resentment, forming part of the deep soil from which Genesis eventually grows. On the other side, the refusal to pretend we have more than we do. No secret prototype, no one-to-one original, just overlapping motifs in a region that spent millennia telling and retelling variations on the same hard questions. If you hold both of those together, something else comes into focus. It's the persistence of the pattern itself. Again and again, across languages and centuries, people keep circling back to siblings, or near siblings, or rival doubles, locked in conflict that seems bigger than either of them. Dumuzi and Enkimdu trading boasts, divine brothers struggling for rule, Cain and Abel in the field, Jacob and Esau in the tent, Romulus and Remus on the hill. You can explain some of that historically. In small kin-based societies, the fiercest competition really does happen inside the family, over inheritance, over land, over status, over who stands closest to the altar. A brother can be your safest ally and your most dangerous rival. No surprise then, that stories fix on that bond when they want to talk about envy or injustice. You can also see a ritual side. Temples rely on offerings, kings rely on farmers and herders. Tales of competing siblings and competing gifts let a culture think out loud about which forms of work it prizes, which sacrifices it values, what it thinks the gods, or God, really want. But even when you've said all that, something remains a little mysterious. Why do these stories feel so immediately legible to people far from fields and flocks, far from the temple economies of ancient Sumer, or the small-hold farms of Iron Age Judah? Why, when we hear about one sibling who feels passed over, one whose work seems not to count, one who turns hurt into harm, do we recognize the emotional landscape without needing anyone to translate? Maybe that is the real open question the tablets leave us with. Not just, where did this story come from? But, why does this pattern keep working on us? Why does the image of blood on the ground between brothers still seem to say something true about the way humans injure one another, and about how hard it is to step back from the edge? The Sumerian texts can't answer that. Neither can the biblical narrative, at least not in any final tidy way. What they can do is widen the frame. They let us see that the questions Cain and Abel carries are not unique to one tradition. They belong to a long regional conversation about violence and mercy, work and recognition, punishment and protection. They invite us to read the biblical story not as an isolated meteorite fallen from heaven, and not as a simple echo of a single older myth, but as one carefully crafted voice in a very long room full of voices. If we approach those voices gently, without the need to turn them into proof texts for or against anybody's faith, they become something else, windows. Windows into how other human beings living under different skies tried to make sense of the same tangle we still live in. Windows into how they imagined gods watching them, favouring some, passing over others, and what that did to their sense of justice and self. You don't have to agree with their answers to find value in the questions. You can simply listen the way we've been listening tonight, letting the details of irrigation canals and temple flocks, clay tablets and carved letters drift past while somewhere underneath, older themes keep pulsing. Envy and grief, guilt and protection, the ache of being seen or unseen. As you settle towards sleep, you might let one small question linger. If people 3,000 or 4,000 years from now were reading our stories, what recurring patterns would they think define us? What would be our version of the farmer and the shepherd standing before the altar? If this journey through Sumer and Scripture has kept you company tonight, or sparked a quiet curiosity, it would be a real help if you'd tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next slow walk through ancient history. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment too. Tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is as these old stories are keeping you awake or guiding you toward rest. For now, the tablets go back to their shelves. The brothers, divine and human, step back into their lines of cuneiform and ink, and the questions, the ones about why some offerings are accepted and some are not, why some wounds close and some do not, those stay with us, softly, as the room grows quiet,